Are we on Zoom? Sorry, I don't have I'm not logged into the, yeah, okay. Good evening. Welcome to the October 16th work session of the McMinnville City Council. I'd like to call the meeting to order at 6:01 p.m. And I'm going to turn everything over to our Public Works Director, Jeffrey Hunsaker, I will assume is going to start.
Yep, I'm going to go ahead and start. Thank you. All right, well, welcome, Council, Mayor, everybody online. Tonight, we're going to be talking about the stormwater regulations that the city has that is relatively new still, the Mercury Total Maximum Daily Load, or TMDL. And I also have a new face for you here this evening. This is Logan Adams. He's an engineering tech in our engineering group. He's been with the city a couple years now and well on his way to getting his engineering license, his PE. So happy to have him, and he's been a big part of implementing this TMDL. So I'm going to ask Logan to just say a couple things real quick.
Yeah. Good evening, Council. Thank you for having me. So Jeff covered a lot of it. I've been with the city for a couple of years. I'm an engineering technician, so I know I've worked with Councilor Menke on sidewalk projects and other things like that, and I believe I was on the PAC meetings with Councilor Geary. Part of the reason I'm also here is my background is in ecological and environmental engineering. So I specifically chose to study things like maximum total daily loads and other things like that. And so that's one of the reasons why I also got tapped for this project, is because it sounded fun. So it's something I'm passionate about, and I'll try to share some of that passion tonight without getting too in the weeds.
Like I said, great that we have Logan here. It's always nice to have somebody who thinks this is fun, doing the work.
Well, if you can make us believe it's fun.
Yeah, that's asking a lot, but we'll try. So, not a large agenda tonight. We'll cover the history of the Willamette TMDL, also the development of McMinnville's implementation plan for that. Going to talk about approval of the plan and also some adoption stuff. We'll go over the 6 control measures that really make up the bones of what this implementation plan is, what the current requirements that the city is doing now, what some of our potential future requirements could be, as well as potential other regulations we could have in the future, such as MS4 or things like that. Like I said, I don't think we're going to be pressed for time. So, Mayor, I don't know how you want to handle questions this evening, if you want to, as we go along, or just like to save it to you.
I kind of would throw that back to you. I think that typically the council likes to ask questions. I don't know how long your presentation is. You say you are saying it's short, so if you...
It'll be pretty short this evening, so we can take questions as we go.
Okay. Okay, we'll keep it casual.
All right.
After you.
Yeah. Now it's not working. Click it on.
Oh, my God.
Yeah.
One too far. All right. So, I did provide a very extensive packet for you for tonight's work session. There's a lot of information about how this Mercury TMDL came about and how the city did the implementation plan and everything there. Wanted to be able to highlight key parts of those documents so you have them for reference. If you have any questions on them, I'm happy to take them this evening as well. But essentially, back in 1998, it was found that salmon in the Willamette Basin had elevated levels of mercury. So in 2006, the Oregon DEQ developed a mercury TMDL as an interim solution. And in 2019, EPA essentially rejected that TMDL and said it didn't do enough, so they called for stricter guidelines. And in 2021, DEQ had developed the new revised Mercury TMDL, and what that did was included the Yamhill Valley, the Yamhill River, as part of the areas that needed to be implementing measures for this mercury issue. And then in 2021, the city was officially notified that we were a designated management agency, which essentially meant that we had to do our part to implement this plan and enforce what's in it. So that's all the regulatory stuff, which with all that, sometimes we can lose the importance of why we're doing this. So I'm going to ask Logan to kind of talk through the science and how McMinnville's implementing this plan is doing our part to address this issue.
Could I ask just a really quick question?
Yes.
So we're a designated DMA, and that was in 2022?
We were notified we were a DMA in 2021, and then we officially took on the DMA status when we did the implementation plan in 2022.
Okay. So does that mean 5 years?
So, yes, the Mercury Team Deal, it's a 5-year implementation plan, started in officially it's September of 22. And then after 5 years, we're going to have to submit a larger report on how we're doing, and then we'll have to do more at that point, and we talk about it a little bit more in the presentation.
Okay, I'll shut up now. Sorry.
Okay.
Just wanted to be clear on that.
So as Jeff mentioned, I'll get a little bit into the science behind it, and if you have questions about that, feel free to let me know. So on the presentation is the mercury cycle, and it talks about how mercury is cycled through the environment and why we're going to care about it and how it impacts us. For the most part, mercury comes from industrial processes that are developed, anything from burning coal to there are certain industrial items that when made produce mercury. Oftentimes for the mercury that is deposited in the Willamette Valley, this is done out of state or out of country. We're not necessarily talking about mercury mining and the water is just falling into the Willamette River or things like that. It typically comes over in the form of rain. When it rains, about 20% of it is then deposited in lakes, rivers, streams, and there's not a lot that we can do about that. But when it falls on the earth, it chemically reacts with soil particles. So soil particles have a negative charge to them. That's just based off of their chemical makeup. Mercury has a positive charge. So as soon as it hits soil or organic matter, it binds very closely to that because a negative charge and a positive charge bind together. The issue comes then when that soil or organic matter is eroded or flushed away into a lake, river, or stream. So we are talking about a mercury TMDL, and mercury is the thing that we're trying to reduce. But the implementation plan is really more of an erosion control implementation plan, because what we're trying to do is to stop that soil or organic matter that has been contaminated with mercury from reaching a water source, and we do that by preventing erosion. So once it enters into a water body of some kind, there is microbes and phytoplankton that will take up nutrients from the soil. They're taking up normal things like nitrogen or phosphorus, but because the mercury is also present, they'll also take up mercury. When it does this, it shifts from normal mercury to something called methylmercury. The issue with methylmercury is that its combination with hydrogen and carbon essentially allows it to disguise itself, for lack of a better term, as organic matter. And it passes through a lot of the membranes, both in fish bodies and in human bodies, that are normally protective, because it looks like it's one of the body parts or one of the different white blood cells or other cells that are supposed to pass through, for example, the blood-brain barrier. What then happens is that something eats the phytoplankton or the microbes, and then a larger fish eats that fish, and so on and so forth. And we get something called bioaccumulation, of where essentially each level up on the food chain is receiving a magnitude or an order of magnitude more mercury based off of what it's eating than the thing before it. And then eventually it gets to humans. And the issues with that are, one, the direct health effects. So I mentioned before the blood-brain barrier. Most of the ill effects that you see from mercury poisoning are that it essentially attacks the central nervous system. It's able to pass into the brain, and so that's most detrimental to young children, people who are pregnant, because it's able to then be passed to the child, and then the elderly as well, just because it's a situation of where it can increase the rate of degradation of the central nervous system. So it can lead to several problems, both cognitive and physical, as a result. The other issue is that it makes fishing, which is an important industry for Oregon and the Willamette Valley, something that people don't want to do because of a fear of the mercury poisoning. And so for that reason, that's why they did a lot of testing to sort of track where the mercury comes from and the best ways to prevent mercury from entering the water system because of the ill effects on humans, as well as a mind towards the Oregon economy and trying to make sure that we are preserving the fishing as an economic source. It's also important to note that it impacts humans, but it does also impact fish and any other animals. For example, bald eagles, I know that that has been an environmental issue for a while. They can get mercury poisoning too, and it has been a concern in the past of any protected wildlife that feed on fish can also get mercury poisoning, can also get the same neurological issues that would lead to their death.
See why I brought Logan this evening.
Good.
He can explain this so much better than I can. Go to the next slide, Daniel. Thank you. So like I mentioned, DEQ notified McMinnville back in 2021 that we were a designated management agency for the Willamette Basin Mercury TMDL. The city had to develop an implementation plan for how we would meet the requirements. There's a fair amount of guidance that is in that document, and then other supporting documents that went out of how a city can develop these plans. At the time, we hired a consultant to assist the city putting together our implementation plan. We had to have several internal meetings, mostly to go over our existing conditions, which are part of, what's our base, where are we going, and then developing the plans, the steps of the plan from there. The steps are pretty laid out for us. We can modify it a little bit with the timing and whatnot, but essentially we had to develop this plan per the standard that had been set by the state. That plan was presented to the council back in August of 2022. There was a work session for that. This was before I got here. And then after that work session, the city submitted that TMDL plan to DEQ. Then on November of 2022, DEQ approved of the implementation plan. Go ahead to the next slide. So one of the things that got missed back in August of 2022 was that staff said that we were going to be bringing the implementation plan back to the council for approval or adoption. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. I'm not exactly sure what happened there. There was a transition in leadership with the Public Works Department in 2023 and some other things, so that could have been part of it. But the plan, the implementation plan that was submitted to DEQ is an enforceable order by DEQ, which means they could, if we don't implement the plan as we said we were going to, we could be subject to violations, which would result in, there's a couple of paths. Usually it's either monetary or they can basically require us to voluntarily do more. That's kind of how it reads. So that was a miss, better late than never. We are going to bring the plan for council adoption on November 12th. So at the end of the presentation, I'll reiterate this, but if there's any major concerns with that, with the council, please let me know. We'll put together the staff report and everything like we always do, but want to hear if there's any major concerns with bringing the plan for adoption in November. Should I cover anything? Yep. All right, back to Logan.
So what this slide outlines is the 6 control measures. As Jeff mentioned, when the city was given TMDL, there are steps and an outline that are provided by DEQ. These match up exactly to the requirements for an MS4 permit as well. The MS4 permit as well as TMDL permits all have the same basic structure, sort of with the idea that a TMDL can then become an MS4 or other things like that, because the points that are going to be touched by both are equally important for both. So those 6 control measures I'll go through quickly and then provide examples are public education, public involvement, illicit discharge and detection, construction site runoff, post-construction runoff control, and good housekeeping. So those are the measures that we had to form the plan around. What does that actually entail? So public education, that's things like student outreach events, having frequently asked questions up on our website, and then updating those as things go by and we see more questions from the community. Essentially just doing our best to educate the general public about the TMDL in general, and then the steps that the city is taking so that the public is aware of what we're doing. Public involvement attached to that are things like volunteer projects, outreach events, making sure that we are eliciting feedback. We're not just telling people, hey, this is what we're doing. We are inviting them to get involved in a myriad of different ways. Illicit discharge and detection, which I'll call IDDE from here on out just because it's a little bit easier for me. Basically, that's things like responding to containment spills. So, for example, right now, our wastewater services team does that. We had an incident back in 2023 of there was a wrestling meet at McMinnville High. One of the buses had a diesel spill from that, so our team responded, helped with the cleanup, but we also had to track that and just submit a report to DEQ, essentially saying, hey, this spill happened. We got there as soon as we could. We cleaned it up as soon as we could, but this spill did occur. Part of that right now is that, the wastewater team is doing that. We don't necessarily have an enforcement mechanism within code right now, and we'll talk a little bit about that later of if we find somebody doing that, what are our next steps from there. But essentially, we're just making sure that people aren't pouring paint down a storm drain or other things like that. Construction site runoff, that gets into some of the meat and potatoes of what I was talking about of erosion control. We want to make sure that when somebody's doing something like grading, where they're removing vegetation, removing trees, and exposing a lot of soil, that makes it a lot easier for that soil to then erode. So we want to make sure that they are following proper procedures. Right now, what that entails for the city is for us to ensure that projects that require it obtain a 1200C permit from the state. Those are for projects that are an acre or more in size as defined by the state. And that comes with an extensive erosion control plan that DEQ reviews and then approves. And essentially our role in that situation is to make sure that a contractor obtains that when needed, and then they're responsible to submit reports to DEQ and ensure that they're meeting that. An important step after runoff, though, is after construction is post-construction runoff control. Even if during the construction project you were making sure that your erosion control is great, if your long-term plan relies on you being able to dump water in such a way that it will cause further erosion downstream, or if you don't properly stabilize a site at the end of it, you're still going to get erosion. And so we're going to make sure that the long-term plan for the way that water is conveyed through a site isn't going to cause other problems downstream. And finally is good housekeeping. That's essentially what our responsibility is as the city. We spend a lot of our time working with private developments and private contractors, but the city also does work. For example, right now we are doing a sanitary sewer rehab project in the Chandler's Edition. So we're making sure that our contractors are following the same standards that we would require of a private contractor. We're also making sure that our team members on our wastewater conveyance team or our Parks and Recreation crew or other things like that are following best management practices to make sure that when they're doing things that potentially could cause erosion or a spill or things like that, that they are working safely and not going to cause further problems.
I wanted to also mention, we've brought up the MS4 permit a couple times, and so the MS4 stands for Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System Permit.
Sorry. Could you do that one more time?
It's literally an M and 4 S's, so it's the Municipal Separate Storm Sewer System. Essentially, there's two major permits that municipalities get from DEQ. The first is the National Pollution Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permit. That's the permit we have to operate our wastewater plant. And then the MS4 permit is if you have a separate storm sewer system. And why you have that is because it used to be that a lot of cities had combined storm and sewer systems. Portland still has that in their downtown. And those combined systems will all flow into a treatment plant, so it will take care of this erosion issue for you. But since a lot of places have the separate system now, that's why you have to have this separate permit for erosion control, because the storm sewer is no longer going through a treatment system that'll get that out. Go ahead and go ahead.
So I think Jeff included in the packet sort of a staff guide. Part of that 5-year implementation plan is that there are milestones that are attached of when certain actions need to be taken by. And so I highlighted a few here. 2023, the main actions that were required of the city were essentially to set up the program. The other big project was the development of a resource portfolio for outreach. So definitely want to give a big shout out to Noelle and her team for helping us to develop one-pager and the pamphlets that are on screen, as well as I have a couple here in case anybody from council would like it. One is a general one-pager that talks about Mercury and the Mercury TMDL, and then one is more specific for builders, landscapers, and developers that talks about erosion control and the 1200C. Those are just things that we've taken to job sites or other outreach events to essentially be able to hand off information and make sure that people are aware of them. This year, our goal was for marking catch basins using volunteer groups. That was something that was selected as part of the implementation plan because that was done several times pre-COVID with a lot of Boy Scout groups and a few of the clubs at Mac High. We've reached out and we've had some issues, either the groups such as several of the Friends of Cosine Creek groups or other things like that sort of disbanded during COVID, and so we're reforming those relationships now in order to get some of those volunteer efforts going. The two major ones that I want to highlight, though, are for 2025 and 2026 because those are going to involve the city council because they're going to be ordinances. So one is the development of an ordinance to prohibit non-stormwater discharge into the stormwater system. So it's similar to what I was talking about before of if somebody is putting something into the stormwater system other than rainwater, we need to have the authority to act on that. And then what the next steps after that is also going to be something that council is going to need to decide. Essentially, hey, I'm visually witnessing you pouring paint down a storm drain. I need to have the authority to tell you not to do that, and then there needs to be some sort of consequence if you continue to do that. That's the non-stormwater discharge. I'm using paint as an example, but obviously, a lot of our focus is also going to be on erosion, basically anything that is going to turn water from just being rainwater to something more than that. Similarly is a erosion control ordinance, as well as developing or revising standards for post-construction regulation. So this is more specific to what we were talking about before with the idea of a developer is coming in, they are going to be grading, they're going to be causing erosion, but if it's less than that 1 acre mark that the state has for a permit, technically we don't have any regulations for that at this time that the city is able to administer. The benchmark that the TMDL recommended was everything between a ½ acre and 1 acre, essentially giving that responsibility to the city. So that's one of the things that we would explore. I think there's a possibility that we'd be able to do both of these in one go, but that's something that we'll want to coordinate with the council on to have conversations about what your feedback is in terms of how you'd like that policy to be implemented and how quickly you'd want that policy to be implemented, just because it is essentially going to be a policy decision guided in some ways by the requirements of the TMDL, but there are still going to be, hey, this is what we have to do, but how we go about it is going to be a decision for council to consider and make decisions about. And so we definitely want to make sure to get your feedback and input on those. And then lastly, in 2027, at the end of our 5-year mark, is we'll have to submit a larger evaluation, essentially talking about everything that we did in that 5 years, whether or not we met all of the goals that we set for ourselves in the initial implementation plan, as well as whether or not those, even if we met those goals, if they did what we thought they were going to do, or if we ran into more issues that we didn't think about. And that's the report that DEQ is going to review, and at that time is going to have feedback for us about what our next 5-year implementation plan needs to look like or needs to include.
Yeah, and I would just like to add that these ordinances are a required regulatory pass down that essentially is in the Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act that requires the EPA, then that requires the states. So Oregon developed an OAR specifically for this, Oregon Administrative Rule, that requires then the cities to have these ordinances that give the regulatory authority for us to enforce these things. So you kind of have to do these ordinances, but just that's where that comes from. It's just this regulatory pass down. So another bit, one of the current requirements we have is our staff maintenance. We've talked about this in the past, but street sweeping is now a stormwater regulatory requirement due to this implementation plan. Catch basin cleaning is also a regulatory requirement. These things were discretionary before. We were already doing them, but now we need to be tracking how much we're doing, staying on track with that, and submitting it in our annual reports. There's also some inspection requirements that come out of this at our shop facilities, and also our outfalls, so the points where the pipes discharge into creeks or the river. Right now, it's just an inspection of them, but this is actually a good thing for us because we're going to get some better data on the state of all of our outfalls and how they're deteriorating over time, since we have to look at them each time. So this is good information that will help us in the future to make decisions on capital improvements that might, or maintenance requirements that we might need to make, so that those outfalls are doing what they need to do. A big thing with outfalls, they have energy dissipation at them. So essentially, riprap is often what's there, or large cobbles, rocks, that as the water's coming out of the pipe, it hits these, slows down, and spreads out, instead of being a channelized flow, which the pipes are a channelized flow, so there's a lot of energy there in the water. So we want to make sure that when it hits these outfalls, that energy is being dissipated and spread out so it doesn't erode the banks of whatever water body they're discharging to.
Some of the other requirements that we have as part of the current implementation plan are related to outreach. A couple that I'd like to highlight is, educational outreach. So we've done several different events with students from Linfield University, and we've also reached out to the McMinnville High School Environmental Science Club. Those are always enjoyable for me. The reason I got into environmental engineering was I went to a presentation in high school from an environmental engineer, and she was talking about her work with the Albany Talking Ponds project. So it's always great when we're able to do that, not only raise awareness, but answer questions and potentially, hopefully inspire other folks to work on this, because it's an interesting field to work in. We also are working on 2 stream restoration projects, one of which is currently underway. It's in the city park right now. That's a collaboration between the City Parks and Recreation Department, the Greater Yamhill Watershed Council, and the Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District. the Water Conservation District and the Watershed Council came and essentially did an evaluation of the portion of North Cozine Creek that runs through City Park. They found that there was some invasive species that were growing along the banks. So they identified a plan to remove those invasive species, replant them with native plants and native underbrush that will both stabilize the soil there that had started eroding away in different areas, as well as provide a more long-term healthy ecosystem along the banks there. And so that's a great project for me personally, again, because it's cool to be able to see the science behind it, and it's also cool to see that impact because it's going to be improving City Park currently, and then it's going to make sure that City Park continues to be a great place for people to go and enjoy nature in town.
We also have some staff training and some reports that we have to do as part of this implementation plan. We have some internal training we do, but one that is a certification that we're required to get now is a CECL, which is the Certified Erosion and Sediment Control Lead training. You have to get that from somebody outside the city. We're required to have at least one CECL on staff. And essentially, you get training on how to review erosion control plans to make sure they're doing what they're supposed to. You get training on how to do erosion control inspections out in the field, and you also get training on how to properly report on that. Right now, like I said, we're only required to have one, but this is something we're probably going to get training for additional staff on, and mostly from a cost-saving standpoint, which you think, oh, more training is going to cost more money, but actually, we have to do this for all of our construction sites in the future, and right now we have inspectors covering different sites, and so instead of having one person trying to go do the erosion inspection for all the sites, the individual inspectors would have that training and be able to do the erosion control inspection when they're already out there at the construction sites.
Currently, as the only person certified to do those inspections, I would appreciate if I wasn't the only one that had to do it.
So Logan also mentioned right now we're required to notify DEQ if anybody comes in for a project that's over an acre and make sure that they have a DEQ permit for a 1200C or erosion control permit before we allow them to move forward with construction. And then we have our annual reporting that we discussed that Logan completes every year by December 1st. Oh yeah, this one's me too. There is essentially a lot of potential expansions to our implementation plan. These that are listed on here are actually taken from Newburgh's Mercury TMDL. Newburgh's on their 4th cycle now for their TMDL. So they've already completed 3 5-year cycles, and each cycle they added a little bit more to their TMDL, and so they're on the 4th one now. And so it has some things addition. So, for example, Logan mentioned that we're looking for volunteers to go out and put those little markers that say drains to streams, don't dump in them, right? And we're looking for volunteers. Well, in Newburgh, they're actually required that they have to put at least 50 of those down every year. And so there's additional things that will likely come from the next 5-year review for our TMDL. Yeah, so we're likely just going to see some increases over time.
And then in addition to increases with the current Mercury TMDL, there are potentially other regulatory requirements that we're going to receive from DEQ. So for example, temperature. So DEQ just recently finished their revision of their temperature TMDL. It has yet to be formally approved, but in the most latest review, the city was identified as a designated management agency for Yamhill County for temperature. There's not currently any requirements or an implementation plan. The feedback I've received from DEQ is because Yamhill County has yet to be fully studied, and so they don't have the science to have any requirements on that right now. But the city's being identified as a designated management agency means that as the temperature TMDL becomes more developed, eventually we're going to have some requirements for implementation that we're going to be handed down. The other thing to look at is the pesticide and fertilizer reduction program. So Cozine Creek, sorry, go ahead, Madam Mayor.
It's water temperature is.
Yeah.
I'm just curious on the, it's not relevant right now, but I'm curious around the technology that's available to do some sort of will we at some point be needing to monitor temperature, water temperature?
Potentially. That's the hard part of, what I can say is that other municipalities with more advanced TMDL projects are required to do that. Whether or not we specifically will is going to be a conversation that comes up with DEQ when we're required to, but I'd say there's a pretty high likelihood.
Yeah, temperature TMDLs, I've seen them implemented a few different ways. One way is just working on shading the creeks. Other areas have gone through programs to plant trees along the creeks. This is something that's probably going to be a focus coming up, because in Oregon, I believe about 80% of the creeks, the shade that's provided is from ash trees, and we have the emerald ash borer now in Oregon, and so those aren't going to be around likely to provide shade on our creeks. So there's something we're going to have to do something about that.
Yeah, the Soil and Water Conservation District confirmed in July that Yamhill County had its first case of emerald ash borers as well. So it's both in Oregon and in Yamhill County.
Other ways you can get temperature, the wastewater that comes out and the process there can increase temperature. Places that have significant temperature TMDLs will use different technologies to try to reduce the temperature of the effluent coming out of a wastewater facility. And then I've also seen in some cases where places use their reservoirs. This is actually done in Washington County. Hag Lake Clean Water Services actually has about, I want to say it's 25% of the water stored at Hag Lake is actually Clean Water Services water, and they discharge it in the summertime to help reduce the temperature in the Tualatin River, which is got significant temperature issues.
Yeah, to speak on that, Jeff mentioned shading projects and other things like that, which are definitely part of it. Or other stream restoration projects that the term is cold water refugia or cold water refuge for fish. But part of the reason they discharge from Hag Lake is they actually spent several $1 millions to increase the depth of Hag Lake, because the deeper you go, the colder the water is. So then they're able to then take directly from that cold water and mix it in with warm water during the summertime. Which I don't see us having a program like that anytime soon, but that kind of goes towards the type of requirements that more stringent TMDLs can potentially produce in terms of, as you mentioned, Madam Mayor, potentially having to monitor directly the temperatures, or at the very least having programs that address shading and other things like that that are seen to decrease water temperature. Something else is a pesticide and fertilizer reduction program. So Cozine Creek was designated, I want to say, 5 years ago as receiving harmful pesticides and needing to have action taken on that. So that's been spearheaded by the Yamhill Soil and Water Conservation District. A lot of what they've done there has been working with the city to create something called an IPM, or Integrated Pest Management Program. Basically what they did is they went through and they found pesticides that killed the different pests that they were trying to, but didn't have the negative effects further downstream. And so there was a lot of training that our Parks and Recreation staff took on, and they essentially shifted what they were using, or they tried to find ways there where they could reduce the amount of pesticides that were being used. I know that the Soil and Water Conservation District is now taking the next step to try to work with private homeowners and private businesses to do the same and to create integrated pest management programs. We could see some requirements coming out of that the city would need to manage as well. Right now, it's been mainly a push from our staff and Parks and Recreation and their relationship with Soil and Water Conservation District to address that, especially because there are several city parks along the Cozine waterway. The other thing, which we've talked about a few times, is the MS4 permit. And so that's something that we've been told by DEQ that we could see within the next 5 to 10 years. And essentially what an MS4 permit is it builds off of a TMDL in a lot of ways. That's why the 6 control measures are there. But similar to how the next cycle of the Mercury TMDL could be stricter and have more specifics, generally an MS4 permit is a step up in that way of what the city is required to do. There's a lot more. The requirements become a lot stricter, and it moves towards things like potentially having to monitor stormwater, to treat stormwater. Right now we have detention criteria to prevent flooding, but it could be something where we would be required to treat stormwater on site to meet specific qualities before we're able to discharge them into the water, other things like that. I think Jeff can probably speak more if you have specific questions about what an MS4 permit could look like.
Yeah, I mean, if there's questions, that actually, we're on our last slide here, so we're on to questions. And just a reminder that if there's any significant concerns about bringing the implementation plan back to the council for the November 12th meeting for adoption by the council, I'd like to hear that. But other than that, just do you have any questions?
Yeah, fantastic, thank you. We'll kind of go around here, and there are a couple clarifying things that I wanted, and I will ask the council to kind of point in a direction or bring up any issues to answer this question on the table. I had some questions to start. You mentioned coal was one of the industries that impacted larger amounts of mercury. What other industries are large impactors of coal mine? Oh, gold.
As Councilor Menke talked about, any sort of precious metal mining, mercury can be used as part of the process essentially to help separate a precious metal from the soil and things that it's a part of. Coal is one I brought up. I don't have necessarily an extensive list. I do know that most of it comes from larger industrial areas overseas, and then essentially the El Nino cycle carries that water that's evaporated over the Pacific Ocean and then falls on the Pacific Northwest. But I can try to get you a more complete list.
Not necessarily curiosity. You said you're going to be referring to this thing, the illicit discharge and something as?
Illicit discharge detection and elimination. IDDE is sort of the shorthand. I don't think engineers or environmental scientists can stop themselves from coming up with more acronyms. But yeah, that essentially refers to, so there's an illicit discharge. I keep going back to it, but you're pouring paint down a storm drain. It needs to be detected. So there needs to be, a hotline that a neighbor can call and say, hey, I just saw somebody pour paint down a catch basin. And then elimination, we need to be able to go, we need to identify that it happened, we need to be able to tell that person, you need to stop this or there will be a consequence.
Great, thank you. And then it's under, it's an Oregon state requirement on street sweeping now, correct? And this is just a light question, anticipating, we usually get a few correspondence a year of people that are unhappy that we have a street sweeping program. And I just want to clarify that if I respond with the, informing them that it's now a state regulation, that that's correct.
Yes, with the TMDL, we are required as a good housekeeping to do street sweeping. It's pretty common that street sweeping actually is a stormwater regulatory requirement, not a transportation one. That's kind of a misconception oftentimes with people, but we need to make sure that we're getting the mud that gets tracked out onto the roads, the leaves that have that organic matter. We were talking a little bit earlier about one of the big concerns right now is matter from tires. Mm-hmm. So coho salmon are very susceptible to this particular matter. So tires has an oxidizer, something that keeps them from oxidizing that's mixed into the rubber. So your tires last longer. Unfortunately, when that comes off, that gets into the water, it gets into the coho, and it literally just fries their brains, for lack of a better term, and they just die. So this is more of a concern in places with significant stopping and turning movements in roadways. It's less of a concern. You'd think it'd be more of a concern like on a freeway where you have just tons of traffic, but those vehicles are just traveling in a straight line, not usually changing speed too much. So the tire wear isn't as significant as it is at like a major intersection in, say, a downtown area. And so this is an issue that they're really trying to figure out, because the treatment required for that specific water quality treatment to get that out of the water is pretty hard to do in an already developed environment.
Okay. And then, not specifically on the TMDL, but I heard a lot of support, specifically on the TMDL, I heard a lot of support that's going to be needed from community engagement and comms. And so my question is not specifically on the TMDL, but it's on that, for you, Mr. Towery. If I remember correctly, the whole budget for comms is it's in your budget, in your department, correct?
Yes, and it's also, like our other central services, then charged out to other non-general fund departments. So there is some distribution of the service out to other departments.
Okay, I don't want to distract us from what we're here to talk about today, but I would be curious to follow up on that, because I think this is a second time recently where we have a project underway with the city that's going to very heavily rely on that. The Parks Pros Plan being the other one recently, where it's a really heavy lift on community engagement, and I just want to be thinking about that as we move into future budgets to make sure that with these increased lifts that we're being thoughtful about how we're getting resources there and where they're coming from within the work that we're doing or that we are budgeting to be supplementing there, et cetera.
It's not unusual in circumstances where jurisdictions create a stormwater utility, that a part of the revenue that's generated by the stormwater utility supports community engagement and outreach, either through directly hired staff who work for the utility or charges to a central engagement and communications function. So there's a couple of ways to address that, and not just sort of spread our existing resource too thin.
Okay, great, thank you. And I'll kind of stop there and go for other counselors with questions. Everyone that's on Zoom, feel free to just open up your Zoom screen, and I'm watching here so I can call on you. Counselor Gary, do you want to go first?
Yeah, so just a couple clarifying questions. Our program we're propping up is really an erosion control program designed to mitigate the already contaminated mercury soil from getting in the waterways. That's kind of the encapsulation of what our plan will be.
That's correct.
Yeah, so it's a prevention of water contamination from already contaminated soils.
Right.
Okay.
Really simple, muddy water cannot reach the creeks.
Yep.
And currently, construction projects of any type over 1 acre and over are required through DEQ to have an erosion control program. And your I understand a connection, Logan, you're our local inspector for that?
I'm not the local inspector for it. Basically because we don't have the authority right now to do those inspections or the things like that, what we do is when we see a project come in that is 1 acre or more, we inform the contractor that they need to reach out to DEQ and provide the city with evidence either of an approved permit from DEQ or official correspondence where DEQ says, you don't need a permit, you're fine. And then in situations where that contractor is not following the DEQ permit, DEQ can send an inspector out, and that person will document it, and then we'll charge them the appropriate fine.
Okay.
In my experience, the DEQ approaches erosion control inspection and regulation pretty differently than the municipalities. They don't have the staff to really go out and do all these inspections all the time. So what they do is tend to just heavily fine and use that stick as the don't do this, because if you get caught, it's going to cost you a lot of money. With municipalities, since we're already out there doing all the inspection, we're taking a much more direct approach of working with the contractors, saying, hey, your erosion control fence is looking like it's fallen over, you need to fix that. So there's a more progressive in working with the development community to make sure the erosion control is not happening when the city takes on erosion control inspection for the smaller ones.
Smaller being under 1 acre.
Yes, for this, it would be between half an acre and a full acre.
Is what we would be propping up.
What we would be required to do, we'd essentially be looking at the larger ones as well, because they're already going to be permitted, but they have to get the additional DEQ permit for those.
So half acre or over
Yep,
in the city would prop up a erosion control program,
correct.
coupled with the building inspection program.
Yeah, likely it would be, right now that process is bundled together with the building program of, somebody applies for a structural permit and they're working over a large area. The engineering department reviews that and would give feedback that they need to provide that official communication from DEQ.
So as a builder, and this may be for the future discussion of propping up that program, but as a builder, I'd call in my foundation inspection or having done this in other jurisdictions that had erosion control programs, prior to calling in that first foundation inspection, you have to have passed your erosion control inspection. And then some of them have interesting catches where it's like every 5th inspection, you have to pass another one, or every 2 months, you have to pass another erosion control inspection. So would it be something that our building inspectors are CECL trained, or would it be an engineer, CECL trained engineer going out and doing those when those are called in?
More likely it will be somebody from the engineering group.
Okay.
They don't have to be an engineer to be CECL trained. It could be an inspector, project manager, anybody. We knew this was coming, so the recently adopted engineering fees included an erosion control as part of that to help cover the cost that's required for engineering to go out and implement this. So that's essentially how it will look, is somebody from engineering will go out. And the timing of the inspections, it's pretty dictated how often you have to do them. I believe it's if it's not raining, you do it at once every 2 weeks, but anytime it rains, you have to go out the next day. So you got to be checking on it. So it's really the nature is what's dictating how often you're doing those erosion control inspections.
Okay.
And then, just to expand on that, part of the responsibility from the city would also be, when we initially give the permit, we would also be reviewing their erosion control plans, making sure that they are doing things that are appropriate. Some erosion control measures work better in certain areas than others, and we would be responsible for that initial inspection that you talked about to make sure that everything is set up correctly. And then, to Jeff's point, we would just have some requirements of how often we check to make sure that they stayed functioning correctly.
And anecdotally, just sharing my experience having been doing those erosion control, it's low cost, minimal startup, and it just makes everything so much nicer. It's just such a good housekeeping measure for a construction site to not be bleeding, hemorrhaging mud everywhere. It's going to be very nice. So you had talked about some contributors, agricultural runoff and those things. Are there sort of industrial, factory, or refinery concerns for discharge into waterways that would be specific to our area, or?
Not specific to our area. That was one of the things that was identified in the 2019 study that DEQ did. Is there's only a handful of mines within the state of Oregon that are still verified to discharge. Most of the industrial discharge comes from either out of state or overseas. The other large contributors, as you mentioned, are agriculture and forestry, just because there are a lot of practices there that can lead to erosion, and that's the responsibility of the Oregon Department of Agriculture and the Oregon Department of Forestry to address.
But in addition, so the Mercury TMDL identifies more than just municipalities that are required to do things. It talks about counties and things like that, but there are industrial users that were also identified as needing to be implementers of the Mercury TMDL. And I'd have to double check, but I believe here Cascade Steel was identified as one of the industries that had to make sure that they were doing their part for a Mercury TMDL implementation plan specific to them and their site.
It seems a giant smelting operation would have come on the radar. So, okay, understood.
As a continuation of that, I'm just curious, given the conversation about the tires and that we had a rubber processing plant here that ground up tires and that impact. I mean, there was a lot of particulate matter in the air from that. Also, from personal experience operating a business across the street for 12 years, my car would often be dusted with black particulate matter.
Yeah, we have we're already regulating a lot of our industries or businesses here. We have the regulatory side of the wastewater that monitors these permits as well. And so this work is kind of getting implemented into them. So there's a lot of pre-treatment things that they have to do on site before they're allowed to have water leave their site. So the work that itself might, have the breakdown with the tires or whatnot, but as long as that doesn't get into the water that's leaving the site, it should be okay.
Because the concern is the water.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
I'm sure every time the street completely flooded,
Yep, probably didn't help.
No further questions.
other members of council have questions? Okay, could I get councilors to kind of respond to this question that we've identified that there was a plan that was not adopted on the timeline it should have been. The city would like to get that business taken care of and make sure that we're in line. Are there any concerns with that from members of council? And if so, or questions that you'd like to put out now so that our Public Works Director has the opportunity to address that and bring that back?
I have no questions, and I'm fully in favor of adopting it.
Thank you. Councilor Chenoweth?
Mayor, any question I have, I will submit in writing.
Okay. Thank you. Councilor Peralta?
Hi, Mayor. Yeah, I don't have any questions at this time either. Thank you.
Thank you. And no questions for November 12th. Councilor Geary?
I have nothing to add. I imagine that editing an already approved document would prove perilous to our implementation plan. So
I was really hoping that you all wouldn't have any concerns because I wasn't quite sure how I would deal with that.
I think you'll find me in an agreeable mood.
Council President, do you have anything you'd like to add at this time?
Nothing to add. Thanks for the presentation.
So one thing for feedback for that would be, from what I heard, a lot of the starting point of that plan, if not a majority of the plan was taken off of sort of a baseline implementation recommendation document. So I think maybe seeing that implementation baseline recommendation document alongside to understand where and why ours veers off, if at all, would be interesting.
Yeah, ours doesn't really veer off. I
Okay.
think one of the only things that ours had that was a little different than what was standard was due to the requirement to look at resources for implementation of the plan,
Oh.
which led to the stormwater pack and look at a utility fee potentially for the future. That was probably the biggest difference from the standard for the implementation plan specific to McMinnville.
So then the inclusion of that to show that it is as standard or as softly recommended as possible, and we aren't going additionally burdensome in our plan for any reason.
Correct. There isn't anything that's really an overreach in this plan. I reviewed it pretty thoroughly to double check, and there's direct correlation for what is required in the DEQ, Willamette TMDL, and what we put in our plan.
Okay, good to know.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much. And the meeting is adjourned at 7:01 PM.